Hello, everybody, and a warm welcome back to the Lockdown LitFest. We hope you're safe, we hope you're well, we hope you're being careful. The sharp-eyed amongst you who subscribe to the newsletters, and you know who you are, and if you don't yet subscribe to the newsletter, can I commend it to you? It's a very simple process, it costs nothing, and we try to keep you up to date with everything that we're doing, with the initiatives that we're starting, and with the range of programming that we're offering. The newsletter comes out every Friday. If you head to www.lockdownlitfest.com and follow the process. It'll take you just 2 minutes of your time. It'll keep you posted and it'll help you keep in touch with us. But the sharp-eyed amongst you who have the newsletter will have noticed that we have started a fantastic new initiative by teaming with the Boxser Diversity Initiative, a fantastic family-run organization from the southeastern United States of America. And it's my great honor and absolute privilege to be able to introduce you to a guest today who has been kindly provided by the Boxser Diversity Initiative. Dr. Michael Jeffries holds a PhD from Harvard University and is the author of 3 books, most recently Behind the Laughs, Community and Inequality in Comedy. And his 2 previous books are Paint the White House Black, Barack Obama and the Meaning of Race in America, published by Stanford University Press, and his first book, which was Thug Life, Race, Gender and the Meaning of Hip Hop. His writing appears in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, and the Boston Globe, and he's a regular contributor on both television and radio at Boston's public broadcasting station, the world-renowned and much, much appreciated WGBH. He also holds the position of Class of 1949 Professor of Ethics and American Studies at Wellesley College, which allows me to say 2 things. One, a very warm welcome to the Lockdown LitFest, Michael. It's a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And 2, Class of 1949 Professor of Ethics. Now, I don't know that much about American academic culture, but if you were Class of 1949, I need to have another look at my birth certificate. You look far too shiny to be of Class of 1949. I assume it's the year in which the chair was inaugurated, but please tell us how that works.
Yes, that's very perceptive of you. I'm not the Class of 1949. The chair was endowed by the Class of 1949 at the college. So that's why the professorship has the name that it does.
You describe yourself in one of the biographies I've read of you, and I've read a lot about you the last couple of days, which has been an absolute joy, as a qualitative sociologist focusing on race, class, gender, and cultural production. Much of that I understand, but a qualitative sociologist, can you define the term for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a split in academia, and some folks really do mix both, but more quantitative types are the folks who do linear regressions and work with numbers, right? Their data sets are kind of transferred into quantitative expressions. My work is more qualitative, and what that means is that I go out and talk to people, and then I write about what they say. So all of my data, as it were, is really qualitative data, right? Talking to people, being in conversation with them, and writing about their lives, trying to interpret and make sense of what they tell me. That's how I do sociology.
What a brilliant job. Can I ask what led you to this? What was it in the life of the young Michael Jeffries that thought, this is what I want to do?
Well, I really didn't know what sort of professor I wanted to be when I went to graduate school, but I knew that I wanted to continue to study African-American studies and race in the United States. And as I moved through graduate school, you have to pick the method that you're going to apply to become a sociologist. And I'm just fascinated by the conversational life. I mean, I feel like when I'm going out and talking to people, I'm the one sort of being educated. They're the experts on the topics that we're talking about. So that kind of research is just so much fun for me. And that's what sort of led me down the path that I took.
And you obviously absolutely love it. I mean, from some of the writing that I've seen of yours, you are completely committed to it. And obviously are very much engaged with the people with whom you speak. I like the idea that they are educating you as much as you are educating us.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at some of the work that I've done, especially in the culture industries, the entertainment industries, music and comedy, I don't have that life. I'm not trying to be a professional comedian, so I can't really educate my readers the way that their testimony does. So it really is a privilege for me to talk to those folks.
Can I come to your first book? I'd like this to be a bit of a voyage around some of your writing because it's so diverse across the 3 books that you have published, which I mentioned in the introduction. It strikes me that they really get to the heart of who you are, how you think, and this fantastic ability to communicate these ideas that you have. So can I start with the beautifully entitled Thug Life? subtitled Race, Gender, and the Meaning of Hip Hop. I mean, obviously, hip hop's come an enormously long way from its origins in the 70s in the Bronx, if memory serves. What was it that made you think this is a fantastic thermometer for gauging American culture, American society, and cultural output?
Well, it really was the culture that I grew up with. I mean, I think that's the place to start. It was how I really began to make sense of the world. A lot of my ideas about not only sort of culture and art, but about politics were being drawn from what I heard in rap music. And then when I got to graduate school, I received the very wise advice that I should study something that I was truly passionate about, because that's what was going to get me through, right? You shouldn't be writing a dissertation or doing research to impress someone. You should be doing it because it's burning in your heart and you need to write about this topic. So that's how I picked the topic. And then for the plan of the book, I didn't go out and interview artists, rappers themselves. I wanted to know, because hip hop was so important to me, I wanted to know what made hip hop and rap so important to the average everyday fan. And that's really where the idea of the book came from.
Given that you focus, as I said earlier, on race, on gender, and cultural production, there is something that comes out of this book, which is the sort of race divide in a way, which is that it is a massively successful corporate enterprise, predominantly controlled and consumed, interestingly, by a white population, but produced by and large by a black population. How did you start to tease this apart, and what did it say about the music industry at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to start with the corporate story, because you can't really understand some of the cultural dynamics without understanding the way the industry is set up. And when it began, of course, that wasn't really the story, because although you had white record executives, most of the decision makers when it came to what was being released to the public were the artists themselves. There was no corporate infrastructure making radio hits. There was no crossover between pop music and hip hop at the time. But as hip hop began to sell more and more copies, record companies became more controlling and more invested, right? And once that happened, the crossover to white audiences just sort of exploded. So then what you have is a kind of discussion among hip hop fans as to whether or not white hip hop fans are interested in hip hop for the same reasons and use hip hop and rap for the same reasons that black fans do. And that's kind of where it sort of started my journey, is trying to figure out, well, what does it mean for the average white kid listening to hip hop? And what does it mean for the average black kid listening to hip hop? Do they actually hear the same thing when they put on the record?
And what conclusions did you draw? Because this is a fascinating and very timely area of endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the things I was sort of writing against is this idea that all white fans are just sort of performing and sort of posing as hip hop fans, right? That they don't really get it. That's not what I found at all. The fans that I spoke with are very educated about hip hop and really personally invested in hip hop. They believe that it holds a deep personal meaning for their lives. The difference, though, is that black fans have all of those traits and characteristics, and they also talk about them in decidedly racial terms. And there's a racialized collective ownership claim. So while the white fan might say this album or this artist is really important to me, black fans told me things like, this is our music. This is important to us. This talks about our politics and our struggle. The collective racial ownership claim that gets advanced by black folks is really at the core of my findings when it comes to what hip hop means.
It strikes me that this is an opportunity for collaboration across a racial divide, across a racial difference. Is that the way it's panning out? Is that the way that it has panned out? Or are the racial silos within the hip hop industry and within the hip hop sort of fan base, I suppose?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the answer truly is both. In some cases, the silos have not gone away at all. I mean, you have white folks living in segregated communities where their only peers and the only fans they ever interact with are other white kids, and they're really not interested in some of the racial politics of the music or the dynamics of the industry at all. But then there are other cases where folks are really interacting with the music in very mixed settings, whether it's at concerts or in virtual spaces and forums over the internet. And in those spaces, there is a real shared understanding of the kind of struggle and oppression that black artists are facing in the industry and the black struggle more broadly defined in the United States.
I have to confess, Michael, my knowledge of hip hop is not terribly profound. I'm aware of some white hip hop artists, probably far fewer than I'm aware of black hip hop artists. And it strikes me that the white hip hop artists for Eminem being a prime example, I suppose, it's largely about being poor, being disadvantaged, being disenfranchised from mainstream middle class and wealth dominated American society. Is that what parallels have you drawn between the sort of the white hip hop artists and the black hip hop artists over and above what you've already said, that actually the collective experience of being disenfranchised transcends these boundaries?
Yeah, I think that some of the white artists who have been most successful have been able to kind of tap into some kind of narrative and of struggle and oppression. So Eminem is a prime example of that. But I think that generally speaking, when you look at black rappers, the range of experience that they're talking about, and they have talked about since the very beginning of hip hop, has always been so much more broad than just a story about poverty or just a story about struggle or just a story about political oppression. I mean, so much of early hip hop in particular was just about having fun.
Yeah.
And it was about the pleasure of making music and making art. And that hasn't gone away at all. So I think maybe one of the key differences is because there are more black artists still doing it, the range and diversity of black rap and black hip hop is as broad as it's ever been. And I think that's a really good thing, even in a time of great political upheaval.
Exactly. What conclusions did you draw about hip hop being able to help those who are disadvantaged, whether to inspire fans or the artists themselves to exercise a level of sort of personal social mobility to get themselves out of the hardships about which they wrote when they started writing?
Yeah, I really think the role that hip hop can play is one of kind of an awakening folks and getting them to understand and interpret their situation, getting them to cope with their situation a little bit better, and getting them to find partners and enter into coalitions with other people. What hip hop isn't really going to do and hasn't really shown us that it does on a consistent basis is it doesn't really prescribe a politics. It doesn't really tell us what the actual political path forward, what the tactics and strategies are, voting, marching. It doesn't tell us which issues necessarily to focus on all the time. So if you're looking for like a true political ideology, hip hop, I don't think is that. It's much better used as kind of a toolkit to help us make sense of our place in the world.
I like the way you put that. That makes enormous good sense to me. Can I come to your second book, which is Paint the White House Black, Barack Obama and the Meaning of Race in America? I may phrase this poorly because it's a slightly unformed thought. What was the book that you wrote, the book that you thought you were setting out to write? And if not, what was the difference?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there's a temptation, especially when you're writing about really any contemporary topic, to chase, almost like chasing a ghost around the room. You're never going to catch up to what's happening in real time as you're writing. So you have to kind of resist that temptation as best you can, because if you just try to write about current events, you're always going to be left behind. So I had to figure out, well, how is it that I want to write about this person that's not biographical? The book is not a biography, and it's not just a catalog of current events. And what I tried to do was figure out which kind of flashpoints from his career I could use to teach broader lessons about how race and racism work. And that's sort of what I set out to do. And I think what I was mostly successful in doing, despite the fact that the ground under me kept sort of changing because the news kept changing.
Yeah. And you had some extraordinary reviews for this book. What did it teach you about race in America? Because, of course, Obama taking the presidency, becoming the president, taking up his place in the White House, led to an enormous debate in America and worldwide, which we're now seeing some ramifications of under a Trump presidency, can be framed as a reaction to Obama having been the president. The pendulum has swung very violently in a very different direction. But of course, for those of us who were pro-Obama, and I put my hand up to that, it struck me that this was a template for a future, a template of inclusion, of the recognition that we are one race.
Yeah, and we may eventually be able to return to that template or continue to pursue it. I think some of the things that it taught me were, I think really the first thing is, if you're talking about politics, the terms that you use to describe politics may not be explicitly racial all the time. For example, conversations about nationalism and xenophobia.
Yeah.
There are racial meanings baked into those terms, right? And yet, sometimes when we talk about them, we don't use racial terms, blackness, white supremacy. That gets pushed to conversations about prejudice and culture, but not nationalism and xenophobia. So I think the lesson of the book is all of these conversations that we have in politics, whether it's about nationalism and xenophobia, whether it's about misogyny, whether it's about the political divide and partisanship, those racial undertones in all of those conversations need to be elevated and talked about explicitly. Because if you try to talk about partisanship in America without talking about race and racism, you're never really going to understand the problem, right? Partisanship in America exists in the form that it does because of racist policies and racist rhetoric. That's the truth of the matter. So if you want to understand the topic, you have to let race into those conversations.
Can I ask you a very personal question, Michael? There are a lot of white liberals who want to engage with this debate, who know that things have gone wrong. They feel guilt, but they also feel fear and shame. They want to bring their force, their power, whatever power they have, whatever privilege they have, to bear to make things a better place, but they're frightened to engage with the debate for fear of getting the language wrong, for fear of being tone deaf, for fear of causing offense. What counsel would you have for those to help them take those first steps to actually not only engage with the debate, but to go on the marches if they make a difference, to write to their MPs or their politicians here in the UK or in the States if they want to make a difference? What advice would you give?
I think there are maybe two things that I would start with. One is to educate themselves as best they can, right? There's no shortage now, and the New York Times bestseller list, for example, has been chock full of books about race and racism. So there's no shortage now of resources for folks who really do want to understand a little bit more about the history and the language of race and how we can and should talk about them. So that's the first thing, is start with the education piece. And the second thing I would say is, instead of initiating some sort of new intervention into this situation, figure out how you can act in solidarity with efforts that are already going on, and oftentimes efforts that are led by Black and brown folk around the world, right? So I understand the need and the desire to enter into the debate and to throw oneself into the fight, but I think you can do that through allyship and solidarity as a first step. Otherwise, you run the risk of shouting down and really marginalizing folks who've been doing the work with great expertise for a very long time.
And who've been fighting this struggle for, as you say, for a very long time. Did you get to meet Obama at all?
I've never met him. No, I have not.
Here's my famous elevator question. You have 5 minutes in an elevator with Obama. Given what you wrote, given what you were thinking when you were writing Paint the White House Black, what would your question to President Obama have been, and what do you think he would have said?
I would like to ask him whether he's changed his thinking about race and racism as a result of his experience in politics. When you read his memoir, right, Dreams from My Father, there's an image that emerges of a kind of racial uncertainty and a journey towards sort of comfort and self-confidence through that memoir. But then when you look at him in the presidency, because he finds himself in the midst of a divided country and subject to the checks of a legislative branch that wasn't necessarily interested in seeing him accomplish his goals, there seemed to be a fair amount of triangulation and a caution when it came to entering into racial debates and initiating legislative efforts directed toward ending racism. That's really what this is about. We can talk about feelings and language all we want, but until the policies change, we're not going to have substantive change in America or anywhere else. So I would like to ask him if, given the chance to reflect on where he was and where he is now, how would he have tried to move things forward maybe in a different way than he did when he was in the White House? Because I have to believe that he learned a great many lessons from his time as the executive.
What would you have asked Michelle?
I mean, I really think the same question. And the other thing I have to know about her is, I would love to know about her is how much influence she really had on the policy side. Because there's a tradition in the United States of a great deal of discretion when it comes to the relationship between the first spouse, a first lady, in historically so far that's all we've had, and the executive. And if you look at the relationship between like Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR, for example, right, we know Eleanor Roosevelt was extremely influential when you talk about New Deal legislation and things of that nature. And I just wonder if Michelle wanted to enter that space more than she had the opportunity to. And if she had the opportunity, what kind of direction would she give to the country, both in racial matters and other policy issues?
Funny you should say that. Actually, it's a very good question. I've had the great fortune of talking to a couple of former vice presidents of the United States who, in their very different ways, expressed the same sort of jealousy, which was they often felt, they know where the levers of power are, but they're not allowed to touch them. And they were rather jealous of the first lady in both these administrations, who actually had far more influence, they thought, than they ever would as being vice presidents. It's an interesting dynamic in American politics.
Absolutely. I mean, I think because of misogyny and sexism, the assumption is so often that the first lady is some sort of ornament or attachment, right? But in reality, these folks are accomplished, many of them, right, are accomplished professionals with plenty of expertise and an understanding of the way the system works. I mean, they've had to navigate extraordinary political challenges as a couple to get to where they were.
We've talked a lot about race, specifically with America. What is your snapshot, your thermometer in the water of what America's relationship with gender is at the minute?
It's not very good. I mean, you have a president who is credibly accused of sexual assault by over a dozen women. You have wage inequality still between men and women in this country, where women are not earning equal pay for the same work. If you look at the representation of the country when it comes to the legislative branch, we don't see nearly as many women in those positions as we do men. So everywhere you look, you see documented sexism when it comes to the outcomes. And then also, just kind of a culture that doesn't necessarily respect a woman's right to her own reproductive health and things of that nature. So we're not in a very good spot along those lines either. And especially when you combine racism and sexism, the perilous position of Black and brown women in this country when it comes to all of those measures is really something that we need to attend to.
Given, as I mentioned earlier on, that the pendulum has swung a long way from the Obama White House to a different form of it, to another extreme, another paradigm in a way. In your role as an academic sociologist, are you starting to be aware of resistance to what pertains at the minute and how uncomfortable and how unpleasant it is? And people are suddenly realizing that they have a role to play in American politics, and their will for it to be a better place, to be the shiny beacon, is reliant upon them actually getting active.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been one of the great lessons of the past 4 years. And you could really begin with the Women's March a few years ago, where you had over 3 million Americans in the street in a single day. At the time, that was the largest ever recorded gathering in terms of protest in the country's history. And there's a lesson there. And the lesson really is that democracy isn't democracy unless you participate in it, right? All of these things that we think are codified in law, the right to assemble, the right to vote, if we don't demand those rights, they will disappear. And voting rights are being eroded around the country. And the only reason they haven't been taken away in even more severe terms is that people won't stand for it. They remain at polling places till all hours of the night. They make sure that their votes are counted. They protest when they think elections have gone wrong. So participatory democracy, that's really the lifeblood of any kind of civil or advanced society.
You're a consummate educator. You get to help form and shape young minds that are coming up through your classes, through the institutions in which you work. I'm sure that responsibility lies heavy on your shoulders. What signs of optimism are you seeing from the generations younger than you, let alone younger than me? Do you see grounds for hope?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of my great sources of hope. I see a great deal of courage and a great deal of awareness. And frankly, desperation. I mean, these folks can see the future being pulled out from under them. When you talk about the climate crisis, when you talk about widening wealth inequality and a lack of social mobility, social and economic mobility, they don't have any illusions about how difficult this is going to be. And they don't have any illusions that they're going to be saved by folks older than them. So they know it's kind of on their shoulders to lead the way. And I've seen that certainly among my students and among students and young people nationwide.
I'm pleased to hear it. I mean, in fairness, one has to, I suppose, respect the office, if not the man who holds it currently. But if you could have 2 minutes of President Donald Trump's time, what's the one piece of advice you would give him?
I wouldn't deign to give Donald Trump any advice. I don't think that he's shown any ability to really take advice, even from folks within his own immediate circle. I really think the focus has to be, again, on participatory democracy and finding those other levers of democratic practice that are more likely to achieve lasting change rather than trying to influence a sole executive.
That's very elegantly put, Michael. Thank you for it. Can I come to your most recent book, Behind the Laughs, Community and Inequality in Comedy? One obviously thinks of comedy as being a fantastically fun business. Of course, why wouldn't it be? It's to do with the business of laughter. But as I know through someone who's very dear to me, who's a comedy director, it's hard work, and it's a business, and it's a career, and it's a craft, and an art, and the science of comedy. What led you to explore comedy or the comedy community as a sort of as an experiment, as a focus for your attention?
Well, I started out wanting to write more about the craft, actually. So I was going around, I interviewed over 60 comedians in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. I was going around talking to these comics, and I was asking them questions like, how do you write your jokes? What's your creative process like? And the more I had this conversation, the more I realized it was going to make for a terrible book. Because what I was going to end up with, a book where a pointy-headed professor like me was going to be explaining jokes to the readers. That's a recipe for disaster. So I abandoned that project at great haste and instead turned my attention to what is it actually like to work in comedy. Mm. And once I took that approach, I think a whole new world opened up to me because you start seeing some of the same difficulties that you see in other creative industries, whether it comes to access because of socioeconomic class or access because of gender. And the idea of a career path in such an unstable business, it was really unfamiliar to me as an academic. As an academic, you get a PhD, you get an assistant professorship, and you work your way up the ladder. There's no such ladder in this particular creative industry, right? And that uncertainty really does shape how they approach their work and their idea of what a rewarding career really is.
Those that you spoke to who think of themselves as successful, or now perceived as successful, did you get a clear steer on what they thought they owed their success to?
It's interesting because I was hearing two things from these folks. On one hand, they would tell me this business is terribly unfair. And then on the other hand, they would tell me whatever I have, I've earned. Right? There's a great belief in meritocracy that they would profess at the same time as they were professing a really astute criticism of the unfairness and the anti-meritocratic functioning of the business. So they really have an investment in this myth, which they will turn around and tear apart if you talk to them for long enough. So it's a really fascinating conversation. The other thing I think that they all said was, the ones who were successful was, they told me that they had really benefited from just being a good citizen and from being in community with the people around them, being good friends to other people in the business, because you need to rely on those relationships to get you your start and maybe even to get a big break in the industry.
Did you get a sense of what the unfairness they thought was?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's different for everyone. I mean, I think, so for women, for example, I mean, the women I talked to in the book talked quite honestly about how comedy is a boys' club and about how much pressure there is as a performer to account for the way you're going to be viewed and objectified by an audience that looks at you as a sex object first and as a comedian second. They talked about when they were writing jokes, how they were going to try to appeal to not only women's senses of humor, but men's senses of humor. Men never had to do that kind of double thinking, right? Mm-hmm. No male comic I talked to said, I really have to think about how I'm going to appeal to women when I get up on stage. They never said that, but women said that almost without fail, right? So those kind of considerations, right? The extra considerations that women have to put into their work just because of sexism and objectification, that's one example of dramatic inequality. And you can see some of the same concerns emerging from Black and Hispanic comics who are worried about appealing to white audiences, not only the audiences at the comedy club, but the audiences in terms of studio executives and folks who might eventually buy their movie script or buy a pitch for a television show or things of that nature. So there's a lot of extra pressure to craft routines for different audiences, depending on the identity that you carry with you.
It strikes me there's a corollary between the sociology of comedy and the sociology of hip hop. as a means of social mobility, as a means of getting out, as a means of making money, providing for yourself, and moving upwards. Am I right to think that way?
Oh, no question. I mean, I think there's a great entrepreneurial spirit actually in both artistic communities. I think in both artistic communities, because rap is so autobiographical and because comedy is also quite autobiographical, there's a sense that the product you're selling is yourself, right? Because you're telling a story about your life. The jokes you're telling are based on your experiences, or the record you write and record is oftentimes a personal narrative about who you are. That's a little bit different from a painting where the object you're selling is more divorced from the artist, right? It's up there on a wall. There's some distance there. But in comedy and rap, you're selling yourself and your experience. That's what you're hoping to leverage into a career and to extend into a career. So there's a lot of pressure there when it comes to the importance of identity to that success story.
Michael, I know that one of the classes that you teach is the sociology of sport. And when we were talking about the corporate culture of hip hop, that it's largely an industry owned and run and controlled by white people, but using black artists, the same thing struck me, that this is what's happening in so many sports, not just in the States, but worldwide. Again, do you see a link there? Are the parallels there? Is this part of the repeating process of racism that is institutionalized in a way?
Oh, no question. And I think we've seen, European footballers have demonstrated their awareness of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that movement was, of course, elevated to a national stage in this country, in the United States, by the American footballer Colin Kaepernick, right, and his protest, right? And if you look at the NFL, the Professional American Football League, you have exactly that situation. You have a labor force that's not almost entirely, but vast majority of the labor force is Black. And you have an ownership group and a fan base that's majority white, and almost no allowance for freedom of expression until very recently within that league, right? So there were calls that these players should be suspended. There was a mandate to stand for the national anthem after Kaepernick knelt down. So what's happened now is, because the political temperature of the country has changed, you're seeing leagues like the NFL change their tune as well and make adjustments and allow their players to express themselves a little more freely. But we should be able to see through that for what it is, right? They see it as a threat to their business model. Their politics, I don't think, really have changed that much that quickly, but they're trying to be politically shrewd. The next step then is for players to seize on this power and force the league to actually do things with the revenue they spend, with the way they hire and fire people, that reflects a racial and social justice agenda.
Can you bring me up to speed? I'm sorry to throw you on throw you on the spot, but what happened to Colin Kaepernick? Because he really took it hard. He was lambasted from all quarters, from his team manager, from his teammates, from the people that ran his team, from sponsors who withdraw sponsorship. I mean, is he all right? Do we know what he's up to?
Absolutely. I mean, he's done fine, because in a way, his celebrity has only risen as a result of this. Right. So he was essentially blacklisted from the NFL. He took the NFL to court and actually won a settlement as a result of not being hired. We don't know what the cash amount of the settlement was. It probably wasn't very much, but that part of the thing has been settled. Also, though he lost some sponsorships at the time, he actually maintained a sponsorship deal with Nike. So he has continued to cash checks from Nike this entire time. And as a political celebrity, I mean, he's really been at the forefront of so much of this work for the past few years, and has had no shortage of honorary awards that he's received and speaking engagements and things of that nature. So he's doing very well, but it should be noted, he still wants to play. Yeah. So there's some speculation that he'll have another chance to enter the league when the next season begins. I think teams are starting to take a look at him again. We
can but hope. He's an incredibly gifted player. Can we talk a little bit about the Boxser Diversity Initiative, which I flagged up at the beginning, that we, Lockdown LitFest, are delighted to be in partnership with, and who have very kindly introduced us to you. We're grateful to them. Can I ask how they came to you, how you came to them, what you know of them?
I have a friend in the Boxser family, so that was really my first exposure to it. And when he first told me about the work that Dan and Lytton were doing, I was very enthusiastic about it, because, I mean, it seemed to me that the call that they were answering, and this is long before racial politics became so trendy, right? The call that they were answering was, they saw a space in their community in Florida, their social community in Florida, which is primarily made up of white, middle class, and wealthy folks. They saw a space to have conversations that just weren't happening, right? And they partnered with a college down there to bring speakers, and have had all manner of really helpful conversations, whether it's about the Black arts, whether it's about the civil rights movement, a series of really important conversations down in that community. And it's a case where they're working in the space that they are in. They are not, we talked a little bit about the kind of trepidation and nervousness about entering into a space where you feel like you don't know the landscape. They know the landscape of the community they live in down there. And that's what they've acted on. I think that really has to be the model for folks who want to make a change. Work in the space that you are and use the resources and connections you have to open up new ideas and move new thoughts and initiatives forward. And that's what Dan and Lytton have done so beautifully in the time they've run the initiative.
That's a fantastic commendation of everything that they're doing. What are you working on now? What can we look forward to being published from the pen of Michael Jeffries in the future?
The book I'm working on now is a book about Black LGBTQ college students in the United States. We don't really have a book-length research project on those students and their experiences. And I don't, to be honest, I don't really want to say too much or sort of talk about a thesis of the book because I'm still in the writing phase. But the bottom line is we don't know what it's like to have those intersecting identities and move through the United States higher educational system. So I'm just going around the country. I've been to over a dozen colleges so far and finding folks and asking them things like, what is it like to go through class? How do you find community on campus? What do you do for fun? What are the things that frustrate you about your experience? Not really focusing or sensationalizing their experiences in college, but just getting them to tell me about their lives. And from that, I hope to write a book that really honors the things that they told me, rather than kind of imposing my own kind of assumptions about the experiences that they're having.
I don't wish you to give away any trade secrets, but given that that's how you research, that you reach out, are people willing to be reached out to? Do you get a sense that people are finally realizing, I do have a story to tell, and they're grateful to see you because you're giving them the opportunity to speak?
Yeah, that's an important question. I mean, I think it speaks to the care that I, as a researcher, have to take when initiating a project like this. I don't just reach out to folks cold because I don't want to inconvenience students at all. I usually go through the university or the college itself to figure out, is there a student organization on campus or a student leader on campus who might be interested in having such a conversation? So I try not to inconvenience folks at all through this whole process. I'm trying to be very careful and sound in the way that I contact folks for a project like this.
It strikes me, Michael, that you are also a shining example. So to any young Black kids who might see this in the States and think, one day I'd like to be a professor. I'd like to be a professor of sociology. I'd like to be the Dr. Michael Jeffries, the Professor Michael Jeffries of the year 2030, 2040, 2050. What would you say to them?
I mean, I think the first thing that we have to do, all of us really, no matter our background, but we have to be able to find folks in our community who can educate us about that field. I think a huge part of the issue, in addition to the inequality that just prevents Black people from getting a decent education in the United States, because the numbers and the ranks of the professoriate here are so low, the mentoring relationships that we need to make it a realizable dream oftentimes aren't there. So that's why it's important, I think, especially important for Black academics, to have sort of a public face rather than just retreating back to academia, and to use the platform that we have to serve as examples for folks who really don't know enough about what it's like to work in the research business, what it's like to be a teacher at the college level. It's a strange career, honestly, in a lot of ways, and the industry of higher education is going through a bit of a sea change right now. But I know that whatever comes out of it, the need for a diverse and engaged workforce among the professoriate that's not going to change at all. So we have to do our very best to remain in a public-facing role as best we can for our own future and those who will come after us.
And this harks back to the old phrase, you can't be what you don't see. And if people do see you doing what you're doing, you will inspire. We inspire by being out there, by being public, and by keeping the ladder down beneath us and helping people up it.
No question. I mean, it's one of the best parts of my job is looking for those students who might someday join my ranks.
Final question from me, and forgive me if this is poorly phrased, but you're connected with your nation, you're connected with your industry, your profession, you're connected with your communities. Are there any Black leaders out there that you are seeing, whether community or state or city or federal or national, who you see early signs of promise that might be able to lead us through what are going to be difficult and important times for the next decade, 2 decades, to get us through to a new world where it is more diverse, more equal, more fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the national scene, there are certainly a couple of names that come to mind. I mean, Kamala Harris, who is a candidate for the Democratic nomination, and if Biden wins, might have some role in the administration. Ayanna Pressley is a young congresswoman from Massachusetts, which is the state that I live in, who has a very promising career ahead of her. But I really think the answer has to be that if we're looking to our leaders, to elected officials, to solve these problems for us, we're going to be looking and waiting for a very long time. The answer is not going to be because of the divine inspiration or work of a single figure or a couple of figures in legislative halls. It's going to be masses of people demanding sensible and long overdue change, like we've seen with these protests, whether it's the Women's March or the more recent Black Lives Matter marches to protest the killing of George Floyd. Those are the kinds of political actions that are going to force our leaders to act. And I think that's the way change has to come about.
You ever consider running?
No, sir.
Politics is not your business.
Not right now, and I don't think it will be in the future either.
That's fair enough. Whereabouts in the world are you? I meant to ask at the top of the show. Obviously, we've placed you in our virtual studio, but let us know. Can you let us know where you are?
I'm in Wellesley, Massachusetts. That's where my college is. That's where I work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael. Congratulations on your work. We will have a buy the book button for your latest book entitled Behind the Laughs, Community and Equality in Comedy. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you. And we are heartwarmed to hear what you say about the Boxser Diversity Initiative as well. Perhaps when your next book comes out, would you do us the honor of coming to join us again? Well, hopefully we'll have a yet larger, more diverse and more global audience for you to speak to. Would you do that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll do that. Yes.
Dr. Michael Jeffries, thank you so much for joining us here at the Lockdown LitFest.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed me talking to Michael Jeffries. A lot to think about there. His latest book is entitled Behind the Laughs, Community and Inequality in Comedy. It's a hell of a read, as are his 2 previous books, which I'm going to reprise for you. Paint the White House Black, Barack Obama and the Meaning of Race in America, and Thug Life, Race, Gender and the Meaning of Hip Hop. One of those must appeal to all of you at some point as in your reading future over the next couple of months. We are delighted to be partnering with the Boxser Diversity Initiative. We give our great good thanks to Dan and Lytton Boxser, who started this initiative. And as ever, we hope that you're keeping well. Please stay safe and love the people that love you back. Look after yourselves. Cheerio.